Hi there everybody, welcome to episode 261 of The Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Eidson, and I want to thank you so much for joining me today. So as we enter the summer, I'm going to spend some time answering some of the most frequently asked questions that I receive from listeners. So we're going to have a few pods. They're going to be pretty bite-sized, so I'd definitely love to hear your feedback on whether you like the shorter podcasts or not. You know, it's something that we do try from time to time, and I have a few actually shorter series lined up for later in the year. So one of the topics that I get asked the most about is negotiation. And so for the next couple of weeks, I'm actually going to share some insights based on my own experience. This week, I'm actually going to dig into the archive and share a part of a podcast that I recorded about 3 years ago, specifically with regards to the question of how to maintain supplier relationships after a tough incumbent negotiation. And then next week, I'm going to share some additional insights that have formed the basis of a keynote presentation that Joanna Martinez, who has been on the show a number of times, and I have actually given at last year's ProcureCon at the Indirect West, and then this year's ProcureCon Indirect East. So I'll share those with you next week. Finally, I wanted to let you know that I'm actually partnering with Officio. So Officio, if you haven't heard of them before, they're the largest pure-play procurement consultancy in the world, based out of the UK, but with a global presence. I'm partnering with them to host a webinar on July the 24th. So we're going to explore the best practices in maximizing the performance of your direct spend and your factory indirect spend with a couple of members of the Officio consulting team. So to learn more about that webinar that's coming up, just go to artofprocurement.com/officio webinar. That's artofprocurement.com/officio webinar. Okay, well, with that being said, let's go into today's topic. As a reminder, I was recently asked for guidance on how to maintain supplier relationships following a tough incumbent negotiation, particularly one that occurs mid-contract. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. I'm going to just take a little bit of my answer out of a past podcast and share that with you today. So here goes. So today what I'm going to do is I'll paraphrase the question that I received. It's basically, how can I maintain a positive relationship with a supplier after a difficult negotiation? And the question really struck a chord with me. It's something that I've had to face a number of times during negotiations, both as a practitioner, but also on the service provider side. And so the typical scenario is that you sign a long-term contract, but things change. Most often a change in scope is needed. Maybe there's a change in the financial or ownership position of one of the parties. But you have a point where a renegotiation is really needed for at least for the betterment of one, if not both parties during the contract. And I've come away from those negotiations either where the relationship has really been harmed beyond repair, or where there's a spirit of we're in this together, both parties are in this together. So what I thought I would do is, in answer to the question, just share some of my perspective on maintaining your relationship post the negotiation. So first, I'm going to assume that it's a relationship that you want to keep, because sometimes the relationships that, they really are truly transactional in nature, or, those are more about getting the best price. And ultimately, the negotiation ends up with it being a bit of a win-lose discussion where you're using leverage as the main negotiation tool to secure the best deal. But I do want to say that even if that is the case, I'd still recommend following some of these steps, not necessarily for the betterment of the individual relationship, but to maintain your reputation, as a fair and ethical company with which others want to do business with. I think that's really important and something that we often lose sight of when we look at deals, on a one-off individual basis. I once had a company that I worked with who, were very keen on stipulating that every single company they deal with is a potential client or a potential customer. And therefore, they wanted their dealings with each one of those individuals who were ultimately working with those companies to be as fair and equitable as possible, because it was all it all fed into the value of their brand as they look to sell products and services to that audience, to that market. Okay, so you want to maintain the relationship on the deal. These are some of the things that have worked best for me. And first, it's to recognize that business decisions are made by humans. They're not made by organizations. So you need to keep this in mind before, during, and after the negotiation. And that's important to me because the number one tenet really to maintaining a relationship at any time, but certainly even more so after a difficult negotiation, is trust. Trust is so difficult to gain and so easy to lose. And really, you lose it, it's very, very hard to get it back. And most times you're not ever able to get it back. And when I look back at some of the incumbent negotiations where I struggled to maintain the relationship past the end of negotiation, it was all because, in my mind, and maybe it's perceived, maybe it was based on fact, but the other party did something to erode my trust in them. In most cases, it was because I felt that the core factor that led them to want to renegotiate was misrepresented in some way, shape, or form. Like I said, sometimes that's perception, but the biggest examples that I had of that, I could find that out through fact after the deal was re-signed. And trust is based on honesty. And that leads me to my next tip, which is related to positioning. So be honest in the reasons that you need to renegotiate or need to open a deal. Share what your challenges are, what your needs are, and what the consequences of not being able to change the deal are. Use facts. So you're going to find, in my experience at least, much more empathy on the other side of the table to do what's best for the strength of the collective relationship if you're open and if you're honest. And I don't just mean that, in the human to human, as I said before, but the premise of the request itself, because this is where I see most negotiations trip up, that you go back to smoke and mirrors, you go back to maybe misrepresenting the truth, and those always revert back to a win-lose discussion from something that you really want it to be win-win, or at least not lose-lose. The next is to encourage optionality from the supplier that you want to negotiate with. So if you've been open with them with your challenges, give your supplier the ability to try and solve them in different ways. So don't just say, as an example, well, I need a 20% cost reduction and I need the service to remain the same. You have to recognize that the negotiation is going to be a give and take to come to a solution that's most optimal for both sides, for both parties. And that often means mutual sacrifices. And the way you get to this, from my experience, is by talking through a lot of options and permutations rather than being prescriptive on what the end result should look like. Because if you do that, the supplier will more often than not find a way that, looks on paper like you're getting what you demanded, but once that change request is signed, they'll be trying to figure out all the things they can do internally to reduce their cost to serve to you, to use fine print, for example, in their contract, that really enables them to provide that product or service at the new price, but under the new conditions. But if you're actually working together, then it's going to be a shared, it's kind of a shared outcome, a shared result, that you've both looked at it and you've both figured out that, there may be some sacrifices, but these are the challenges that need to be solved. And your supplier may have innovative ways of solving them that they haven't really thought of before. And again, when I think back to things that I've done, you can really be flexible in coming to solutions when you know that your the company that you're working with, your client, for example, is has a number of challenges or a number of problems that they need to solve that may not have looked apparent when you made the first request. So once you have come to an agreement on what the new terms and scope should look like, don't overburden your supplier in red tape. I can't tell you how many times I've renegotiated a deal only for the other party to then require almost a complete rewrite of the contract. And it's a process that can take weeks, possibly even months, to actually consummate the deal. And I've seen companies take advantage of this in an attempt to rewrite sections of the contract that they don't really like, but that were never part of the renegotiation. And this really just goes back to the trust factor once again. And finally, when it comes to governance, be flexible with your immediate requirements as your supplier transitions to the new contract or the new delivery model. Because if you've followed on all the tips so far, so openness and optionality, for example, being a couple of the big ones, then it's likely that your supplier is going to need to adjust the way that they support you to take account of what was renegotiated. And if you really want to focus on maintaining those relationships, just recognize the fact that they may need time to adjust to that change. And there may be a short-term impact on the performance that they are providing to you. But just be cognizant and ask how you can help them throughout this transition process, and rather than trying to beat them up with KPIs or SLAs as they are going through what may be a difficult transition. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.